It was the
Long time ago.
On the Fritz tour, and you signed my vinyl record for me. It was great. Yeah, and I love the music. I love how it challenges norms, how it challenges conventions, makes us think deeply and differently about some of our Christian convictions. And personally, I really like the punk and the new wave sound that you had, certainly in your early years. And I've read that you've been called anything from the evangelical rock's court jester by Newsweek to a gospel Elvis Costello by USA Today, and here's one of my faves, a satanic influence upon the lives of young people by evangelist Bob Jones III. So
yes, that's right. Yes,
we'll take the good with the bad, or the good with the ill-informed, as the case may be. But
right.
I would love for you just to talk to our listeners a little bit about your story. Tell us about what. Talk about the origins. First of all, where you came from, born in California, moved to Denver, and then we'll get into a little bit of how you began on your musical journey. So you grew up as the son of a Baptist minister just outside of Denver. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
And my parents were. My dad was a member of a kind of a more progressive Baptist denomination, and he was a conservative guy in a kind of a more liberal denomination. So that was always interesting to watch that unfold. And he was pretty outspoken about what he believed, and if he thought his denomination was making an error theologically, he didn't have any problem sending letters to every pastor in the denomination to speak his mind. So it was interesting growing up around that, because my parents were fairly conservative, but they were also very consistent between what they preached and the way they lived. When I got to my teenage years and I was supposed to rebel, I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to rebel against. So I never went through any big rebellious stage. But I did end up going to a pretty radical university, the University of Colorado at Boulder, for college. And I was a music major and a film minor. And around that same time, I was also serving as a youth pastor for my dad's church. I was supposed to fill in for 6 months until they got a new one, and I filled in for 5 years.
Wow.
And so the difference between what I was trying to communicate, biblical truths I was trying to communicate to my youth group, and what I was experiencing every day on campus at Colorado University was pretty wide. And around that time was when I was introduced to punk rock and new wave music, primarily coming over from Britain. And I really liked the music, and I also liked the way that it engaged with contemporary issues. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to do a sound like that, but and also engage with issues from a Christian perspective. I was not afraid of satire, so I used a lot of satire, and it felt like also a good way to bridge what I was trying to communicate with my youth group in a more contemporary fashion, I guess.
I think it's so interesting that you didn't come from, I think I read somewhere, you said, I never had a chip on my shoulder. It was not like I was raised in some sort of environment with blinders and a hypocritical environment. I need to, as you say, rebel against that. You don't know what am I going to rebel against, And yet God gave you this open, it sounds to me like your household was fairly open to various things, didn't have a very strict view of what was acceptable in the way of the arts. I guess, is that a fair statement?
Yeah. I think they were, my parents were fairly conservative, but they were more open to kind of what was going on in the mainstream culture. And they gave me a pretty wide berth to explore things. And so that helped as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of your early influences, I think, is, if I remember correctly, was The Clash, right?
That's right. Yeah. This band, The Clash from England, were a big influence, probably the main one. And they were very outspoken on issues, and most of their songs were issue oriented.
Yeah,
and I just really liked the way they They handled, they would tackle issues. They certainly tried to live out what they were singing about. And so I thought that was admirable. They weren't particularly good at giving hope. And
right.
But as a Christian, we believe we have ultimate hope in Jesus. And so that was where I thought, well, maybe I could, point things out that are wrong, both in the world and in the church, but also offer hope as well. And I think one of the reasons I got called a satanic influence by Bob Jones is because I wrote a song called "We Don't Need No Color Code."
Yeah, you did.
Because Bob Jones had a policy at the time of no interracial dating,
right?
Which I think would be a pretty hard thing to justify using scripture.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That was where that song came from, and I don't think they were particularly happy.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into a little bit more of his musical journey, some of his film work, but most importantly, how do we think about the arts? You know that we did an interview recently on the Dead Sea Squirrels, and he was involved in that production as well. So Steve Taylor with us, also Steve Miller in studio, and we will be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Television host Mike Rowe has been an advocate for blue-collar workers who have kept this country running. He explains that opportunities have never been better for anyone willing to work and willing to learn a skill in demand. Unfortunately, we have 7 million men ages 25 to 54 who are not only not working but not looking for work. Economist Nicholas Eberstadt refers to that in a recent Washington Post op-ed as the flight from work. The U.S. currently has 11 million unfilled jobs. Businesses in every sector nationwide are desperate for workers, including positions that do not require high school diplomas. Mike Rowe has provided more than 1,000 scholarships to young people through his Mike Rowe Works Foundation. They are trained for skills that are in demand: welders, steam fitters, pipe fitters, mechanics. None require a 4-year degree. He says there's never been a greater need for skilled workers like right now. He says if you're inclined to think that way and work that way, the world is your oyster. Unfortunately, if you're not, and a man, you're probably sitting at home spending 2,000 hours sitting in front of a screen. A recent Fox News poll asked this open-ended question: what message would you send to government? A majority said, lend me a hand. The only other time a majority said that was during the pandemic, but we are 2 years past the pandemic and lockdowns. Mike Rowe argues that two things could be true at the same time. First, there are people who need a hand who are well-intended and willing to work. Second, many others have been given a hand and have done nothing with what they've been given. I'm always willing to give someone a hand up to better themselves, but I think it is time to question whether we should be giving a hand out to millions who won't work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with me today, Steve Miller, and by phone, Steve Taylor. And Steve Taylor, take a deep breath here, is not only a record producer, musician, writer, director, professor, and filmmaker in residence, but individual really helping us understand a little bit more about how to think about the arts from a Christian point of view. And Steve, for just a minute, maybe we can get a little bit of your musical journey. I mean, Continental Singers and working with Newsboys, and I don't know that you can summarize it quickly, but I'll give you a chance at it.
Right. So yes, I actually was. I don't typically lead with the Continental Singers. That wasn't particularly my style of music. But
exactly.
Yeah, well, that's why I was having fun with it, because it's about
Right.
as wide as you can imagine, right?
Yes, I traveled with them to Poland during the Solidarity era, and that was. I was offered an opportunity to go there, and it's like, well, that's too good of an opportunity to pass up. And then was started recording my own music right out of college, and got a recording contract with Sparrow Records, and did about 3 or 4 albums for Sparrow and Myrrh. And then I had an opportunity to form a rock band called Chagall Guevara that was precipitated my move to Nashville. And we got signed to MCA Records. It was a big deal, but the record wasn't particularly successful. And we were still more successful than all their other unsuccessful rock bands. So they wanted us to do a second album. And we did not want to be with MCA anymore. So we toughed it out for a year, and then the band ended up breaking up. But that's what got me to Nashville. And that's when I started producing. So some of the Newsboys albums with songs like Shine and Breakfast, I produced those, and then also wrote the lyrics for their first 3 or 4 kind of hit albums, and then produced a song that your listeners would probably be familiar with, a song called Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer.
Oh, yeah.
If I played the song and people have never heard it, I know they're either raised by Amish parents or they've never stopped at TJ Maxx, because otherwise you can't avoid that song. And it's arguably more popular now than it was even when it came out.
Isn't that amazing?
That sound was I remember that the Sixpence. There was a group also called the Sundays. I don't know if you remember them, but they kind of had a similar sound. And I'm going to go back just a little bit to we spoke about at the end of the last segment about the Clash and other bands like that, and you made a great point that they were big on questions but kind of short on the answers. And I loved about them. I mean, when I was in college, Combat Rock was just between that.
A good album.
Yeah, between that and your stuff and Terry Scott Taylor with Daniel Amos and stuff was just kind of always going on in my head. I love the way that they faced some of the issues going on in the culture, but it was a letdown, right? Because at the end of the day, they weren't necessarily providing answers, and that's a tough. It's a tightrope when you walk that as a Christian, isn't it?
It is, yes. You're always trying to avoid. Part of the reason for putting things in a musical setting is it's easier for people to kind of take it in, and you don't want to come off too preachy or anything like that. And that's part of the challenge of when I got into filmmaking is Christian films at the time tended to be pretty simplistic kind of salvation stories. There's nothing wrong with that, but those are hard to depict on screen. An interchange of heart is a hard thing to depict. And so I preferred movies. There's a movie called Tender Mercies that I really loved. Mm-hmm. And if you'll remember in that movie, Robert Duvall's character becomes a Christian early on, and that's when everything starts going wrong for him. And and that's where he manages to hold on to his faith despite all these things going wrong. And I thought that was a more true depiction of the Christian life than, a story where someone becomes a Christian and everything starts magically going right. And so I've kind of always kind of tended towards stories like that I felt offered hope, but also were based in reality.
sounds to me a little bit like reading the book of Ecclesiastes. I mean, there's every reason to hope, but it tells you straight up that there's a lot of vanity going on. There's a lot of things that appear to be pointless. I mean, you started off right out of the gate with "I want to be a clone," which funny thing. I was looking that up because I wanted to refamiliarize myself with it, and I looked it up on Amazon, and right below it was a book called "I Want to Be a Zookeeper." I thought, I don't know. There's some connection there, but
there's some connection there, right?
So this EP, 6 songs. I remember thinking, I've never heard anything like this. This is really, really amazing. And then you went on with Meltdown and On the Fritz, and then you went on to production work. You mentioned Sixpence doing their stuff, and they did a version of "There She Goes," right?
That's right. Yeah, that was their second hit single, right?
That was, I read that and I thought, because when the Laws, who did that originally, came to town, I saw them in Dallas back in the early 90s. My goodness.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a band that kind of imploded like many of them did.
Right.
But if I think of you, a lot of what you do, I like to say, you like to poke the bear a little bit. But I think you do it with a desire for perhaps reparation, as in repairing, and a desire to build up, in the way that Erasmus wrote the book In Praise of Folly, right? Looking at the insanity and the absurdity of that. Is that a fair statement that you like to poke the bear? Come on, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily seeking controversy, but it somehow seemed to find me in a lot of things that I did. And part of it's because the bear doesn't like to be poked. And one of the things I got a lot from fellow Christians is like, why are you airing our dirty laundry for the rest of the world to see? And I'm like, oh, they see it. They just think you don't see it. So I'm not airing out anything. They just think that we're clueless and that we don't realize how bad it is when we refuse to recognize, the sin can be propagated by the church.
Yeah. Steve Taylor with us, and of course, Steve Miller in studio. Steve, for just a minute, you mentioned the idea of satire. And of course, people now that everything from watching the Veggie Tales, and of course, we mentioned Dead Sea Squirrels, to Babylon Bee and the rest, it seems like that is a genre or a style that's being used more and more. And that was something that you sort of stumbled onto early on, didn't you?
Yes. So I liked to defend the use of satire by pointing back to Scripture. And, you see it in when Elijah and the prophets of Baal had their showdown, and the prophets of Baal aren't getting anywhere. And Elijah, he starts poking the bear, well, maybe you just need to shout a little louder. Maybe your God's asleep. When Jesus uses analogies like you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, or take the log out of your own eye before you remove the splinter in your brother's eye. I just thought there was enough in Scripture to where people would understand, well, that's still a valuable and valid way to communicate today, even from a Christian perspective.
And again, I think that's been very useful. We do need to take another break, and Steve Taylor with us. And by the way, I might just mention a couple of things. Steve Miller, I mentioned his whole booklet that we have made available on Imagination. I might mention one that I've edited that is oftentimes used in Christian schools, Arts, Media, and Culture. That one would cost you, but the booklet is available free of charge. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about Steve Taylor or Lipscomb University or a number of others before the hour is up, we'll talk about some of the things he's teaching students there as well. And of course, we have on our website today the Viewpoints commentary, Anchored to Truth, an upcoming Truth Team, and our Take Action item. If you haven't taken an opportunity to tell your member of Congress about no taxpayer funding for abortion, that is one of those action items we have given to you. And I want to keep it up for another day or two before we move on to some other topics there as well. As you know, we will certainly in the next hour be talking about some of the executive orders that have been signed by President President Trump, including what he may be saying tonight in this unofficial State of the Union address. But the better solution is to have some of that coded into law. So over the next couple of weeks, we will be talking about a couple of issues where there is already an executive order, but that's not as permanent because the next president could come up with a different executive order. So we're beginning to focus on some things that could be very significant and pieces of legislation that can move through Congress. So if you haven't taken time to check out my commentary or our Take Action item or some of the videos, we have all that available at our website at pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Steve Taylor right after these important messages.
Are you confused about changes happening in Washington, D.C.? Well, you're not alone. Are you frustrated that you can't get the full picture of what's happening from the mainstream media? You are not alone in that either. And that is why Americans need a voice they can trust, a voice that provides accurate news, trustworthy information, and most importantly, a voice that is anchored to God's Word. Point of View is that voice, but we need you. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week, where we encourage listeners like you to join the team of people keeping truth on the air. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a difference right now by visiting us online at pointofview.net and join the team. That's pointofview.net. Or you could call us toll-free to join at 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with Steve Taylor. Let me just say that one of the reasons we do these from time to time is because we believe that Christians should be in the arts, whatever particular art form we might be talking about, how important it is for us to encourage the next generation to see that as a viable calling and ministry as well. So I hope that this would be of help to you. If you know somebody that might benefit from some of this conversation today with Steve Taylor, you can maybe click on that red button that says watch or listen, pass it on to them as well. Steve Taylor, as we mentioned before, is a record producer, musician, writer, director of films, which we're going to get in just a minute, filmmaker in residence at Lipscomb University. But Steve Miller, my producer in studio today. And Steve, again, we've got all sorts of questions, especially given the fact that we were talking about music and then film.
And then film. Yeah, Steve, I think of you, and I mentioned poking the bear and all that, not to make too much of that, but a bit of a disruptive influence in a good way. I kind of think of you as the Banksy of Christian music. I don't know.
Well, that's high praise. Thank you.
Disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed. Do you see that as something that's carried over into your film work as well?
Yes. Films are, of course, harder to make and more expensive, and so they tend to take a lot longer. But the first movie I made was we used to call them black and white buddy movies, where it was the tale of two churches, and the Christian singer Michael W. Smith played the associate pastor of a big suburban megachurch.
Wow.
And he gets called down to that church is supporting a urban, primarily black church, and so he brings the pastor of that church up to speak to the congregation, and the black pastor is getting fed up with all talk and no action, and says something that gets Michael in trouble, and so he ends up getting sent to work at the urban church against his will. And of course, in all those types of movies, you got two people who don't like each other, and by the end, they figure out a way to get along. And so that movie, I think, was prescient in many ways. It was a little controversial at the time too, but I think it was a valuable look at why is it that Sunday mornings are still the most segregated hour of the week, and what can we do to help change that?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up movie was really controversial. It was based on Donald Miller's best-selling memoir, Blue Like Jazz.
There we go.
And
yes. More people know that one for anyone. Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah. So in that one, the actual story is Don Miller grew up in suburban Houston and went to Southern Baptist Church. And in his 30s, he moved to Portland, Oregon, and decided to audit classes at this nearby college called Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which the Princeton Review once called the most godless campus in America. And while he was there auditing classes, he discovered there were some fellow Christians on campus, but they were all afraid of being outed. And so he tells about that experience and what it was like. And the highlight of the book for most people was during the end of year big party celebration where it's just, drugs and alcohol and all kinds of debauchery going on. They built a confession booth, and they dressed up like monks, and all these kind of drunk Reed partygoers lined up to confess their sins, thinking that that's how it was going to go down. And instead, Don and his fellow Christians on campus kind of came out of the closet and said, we're actually Christians, and we're sorry for things that have been done in the name of Christ that aren't Christ-like. And it was a really powerful moment in the book. And so I wanted to take that moment and turn it into a movie and end the movie with that powerful scene. And so we ended up making that movie. That was probably about 2012 is when it came out. And that was very controversial because it was not a family movie. When we think of Christian films, we usually think of family entertainment. I didn't see how I could tell that story in a realistic way at the most godless campus in America. Maybe it wouldn't have to be R-rated, but it was probably going to at least be PG-13.
Yeah.
And I thought, in my opinion, if you read the Bible, it's not always a very family-friendly book either. And so I thought that would probably be something that at least adult Christians would embrace, and that turns out not so much. So it was not a particular success. It debuted at the South by Southwest Film Festival, so it got some good notices. But yeah, it alienated a few people too.
Well, I suppose in a way just as well. I hate to say it that way. I mean, maybe it's going to bring in the people that need to see it. I loved it. I thought it was strong. I thought it was heavy hitting, and it's just the sort of film I like. But that's, maybe that's partially my taste, and maybe not. But I thought it did what it, I guess, quote, needed to do. I think of I'm always reminded of Flannery O'Connor when I hear people talk about how things ought to be. In the words of one of the defunct radio stations in our area, safe and fun for the whole family. Her writing, she said, sometimes when you're preaching to people, when you're talking to people who are hard of hearing, you have to yell, that sort of thing. And I think in a way that's what you've chosen to do. And kudos, that's me talking. I think a lot of people appreciated it, but you cannot do anything. Like with Chagall Guevara, you didn't find that to be commercially successful. But at the end of the day, you're probably glad that you did it.
I also pulled up the one from New York Times where it says the Bible Belt goes to college is how the New York Times described it. So,
right, yes. Well, all that to say, now I'm working with Mike Nawrocki, co-creator of VeggieTales, to amend for Blue Light Jazz. No,
you're doing your penance. But, good for you.
That's right. I'm doing my penance. But that's been a total blast. And one of the things I loved about VeggieTales, which I think most of us love, is that it was full of biblical truth, but it was so funny and so much fun. And those silly songs still stand up. I could throw a rock and hit someone right now who could sing the Hairbrush song.
Yep.
It's just it's had a really deep cultural resonance, and of course, not only kids but parents and now college students, and it's just gone very deep into the culture. And Mike is someone who I've loved and gotten to work with before on some of their prior projects. So when he told me about this new project and asked me if I'd want to be involved, I jumped at the chance. And so we're very happy with the way that one's turned out. And
we just had him on, I don't know, was it a couple of weeks ago? Mm-hmm. And I was so excited. I was telling people, we're going to have Larry the Cucumber on the show.
That's right.
I mean,
he's like the world's nicest guy.
It's something that I wouldn't have thought when it came out that it would become such a phenomenon. But it certainly did. And I think the fact that you are involved in projects that range all the way from Blue Like Jazz to Meltdown at Madame Tussauds to VeggieTales says something about your creative your creativity and why you do what you do.
Well, we're all working for the same goal. We just have different roles to play.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the questions I think a lot of people might ask is, if I want to go into the arts, what to do? And certainly we want to mention that you are teaching at Lipscomb University. That's not the only place where you could learn about the arts. But Steve, wouldn't you agree that in the old days, since some of us are a little bit older around the table, it was hard to get an album out? Now you can do all sorts of things through the internet. It used to be hard to get a book published. Now it's pretty easy. Most of the people that actually get started are doing podcasts and videocasts and things of that nature. And so in some respects, the technology is not the hurdle, but you still need a biblical point of view, and you still need creativity and need to know how to tell a story.
Yeah, that's really well put, Kerby. The real barrier is the barrier of excellence. Yes. I had a mentor, Bob Briner, who wrote a book called Roaring Lambs.
Bob. Yeah.
Is that right? Well, yeah. He was a great guy and a great mentor. And his point was, if you're not ready to be excellent, don't bother. And the reason a lot of Christian media doesn't have a broader impact on the culture is just because it's not good enough. So one of the things that I've loved being at Lipscomb in Nashville, which is a Christian university, but we've set up a college of entertainment and the arts that's very it's multidisciplinary. So in most colleges or universities, you've got like a theater program, but that they never talk to the film program, and they never talk to the music program, and who never talks to the arts program. And we've set up a situation where we've got a really great film program and a really great animation program run by the Bancroft brothers, two Disney animators.
Wow.
Got a fantastic theater program, but our film programs have to work with theater students because usually, college age films, it's not they're not bad because they don't know how to use a camera. They're bad because the writing and the acting are terrible.
Yeah.
And so we really try to have everybody working together.
Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. Bob Reiner, Roaring Lambs, and other books I might recommend. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Steve Taylor. Let me just mention that if you'd like to learn a little bit more, we have a link next to his picture that shows the link to Facebook, and that will take you to Steve Taylor Presents at Facebook.com. You can go there, find out a little bit more about him. Of course, we also would encourage you to find out more about Lipscomb University, which is in Nashville. In studio with me, Steve Miller. Only got a few minutes left, but I thought we'd get back to this idea of kind of a Christian philosophy of the arts.
You bet. Steve, there's a book out there by yet another Steve, Steve Turner, called Imagine, a Vision for Christians in the Arts.
Yes.
If you may be familiar with that. In that book, he quotes T-Bone Burnett, and I love this quote. T-Bone says, if you're a Christian, you can write, songs, a Christian singer, you can write songs about the light. You can write songs about what you see by the light. And that's what I do. That's what he would say. And I think that may be a good bit of advice to people who go into the arts and are struggling with, do I just do good Christian art, or do I do Christian art or just good art? You mentioned earlier the problem sometimes with production value is not that you don't have a good DP or an audio engineer or a cinematographer. You don't have a good story, and you really don't have good acting.
Right. Yes. That's funny you mentioned that book. That book was actually birthed in my living room.
Oh, that's right.
Steve Turner came and spoke to a bunch of Nashville-based artists, and we turned it into a pamphlet, and then he took the pamphlet and expanded into a book. So,
there you go.
I remember reading that, yeah.
Full of good advice, and we need both. We need people, speaking to the choir that do it really well, and we need people who are bold and are able to communicate Christian truth to the broader culture through whatever artistic medium they're good at. So we need them both.
Yeah, we need excellence, and I have worked in both Christian theater and film, and in secular theater and film, probably more in secular, because there's just more out there, and I have found that there's not always. There seems to be less of a concern with Christians doing theater and film to do it well. This is an overstatement, but in general, the idea is, do you love Jesus and do you want to do a show? And this is not. I mean, you wouldn't ask someone to get up on stage and sing at a church service if they, let's just say, we're not equipped to do so. I mean, and yet sometimes as actors we find that, it's okay, you just need to love Jesus. I would like to ask you, and I want to not be too cynical about this. Well, I ask you, though, what your advice would be to Christians who are involved in the arts and who want to go out there and to dive into a secular culture and to go to universities like Don Miller did and do things that are meaningful and where they can become salt and light.
Right. Well, like we said, you need excellence, but man, you really need the body of Christ, fellow Christians, to be in fellowship with and supporting you. And they really need to go hand in hand. And people that I admire who are Christians who are working in the mainstream, they almost invariably are people who not only have a deep faith, but have a deep connection to the church. And we need them both.
Yeah.
In terms of maybe the students, if somebody were to enroll at Lipscomb University or somewhere else, because there are quite a number of programs that are there for individuals who are going into the arts, you might share a little bit about that, because you were talking about the diversity of the curriculum, and I think that's important. Sometimes we go too quickly into whether it's journalism or the arts or even into science or other areas, and I think a broader curriculum is actually something that would be more advantageous for a future musician, a future film producer, don't you think?
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Lipscomb is, most 18-year-olds I know, they know they want to be in the creative field. They're just typically not exactly sure what it is. And so that's why we really stress that they get a broad overview of the creative arts, are able to try different things, collaborate with people in other disciplines, but then also, they're taking Bible classes as well and getting a solid foundation for their faith. And I think the two need to go hand in hand.
Steve, how would you describe or could you comment on some of the biggest challenges for you personally and artistically through the years that you've faced and that might help others in similar struggles?
Well, in some ways, we're living in a really good time because, 30, 40 years ago, we had to make the case for why the arts were even important within a Christian content. Mm-hmm. And I think that's largely changed. There's probably still some pockets of resistance, but in general, I think the church recognizes that we need the arts and we need excellence. I think there's still a hesitation or a tendency to equate Christian with family, and I am all in favor of quality family entertainment. In fact, the movie that I just produced stars Tony Hale and premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. It's called Sketch. It's actually at 100% on Rotten Tomatoes right now, and should be coming out this summer.
Oh, that's awesome.
But and it's not it's not a Christian movie. Excuse me, but it's a movie with deep resonance and has a lot to say about grief and how kids process grief. And it's also really funny and action-packed. I think we call it a cross between Inside Out and Jurassic Park. But I think it's important that as Christians, we're also able to create just really good quality entertainment for mainstream audiences as well, and to do it with excellence. So it's a good time to be creating things, and it's I think an important time for Christians to be exercising their faith in the public square through the arts.
Yeah. Could you mention that again? The name of the film that Tony Hale's in?
The movie is called Sketch.
Sketch. Okay.
Sketch. Yeah.
Okay.
Should be coming out hopefully in July nationwide.
Tony Hale's a great guy. I met him once. We had lunch with some people, and that was about the time Arrested Development was taking off. And
yes.
I think he's fabulously funny and a strong believer. So that's exciting.
Yes.
Good stuff.
That's right. He's one of my favorite actors and one of my favorite people, and I can't wait for people to see this movie.
Awesome. I will do that.
Might just mention again, we'll be watching for Sketch. And again, I think it was February 12th when we talked about Dead Sea Squirrels, since we did mention that. That's there. Right. So you can learn a little bit more about that and go back and find that on our website.
Yeah, that's right. It's streaming on Minnow TV, and I think we just released episodes 6 and 7. So there's 13 episodes in all. And I got to say, it's full of biblical truth, but it is genuinely funny. It's really funny. So I hope people check it out.
Are you doing any voices on this one?
I am both a talking donkey and the Apostle Paul, so, typecasting.
Well, there we go. So, again, if you did not hear the interview, that was February 12th on Point of View. Just go to pointofview.net and find that. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to contact Steve Taylor a little bit more about him, click on that button that says Facebook. That will take you to facebook.com/Steve Taylor Presents. There's a way in which you can connect up with him. And, Steve, thank you for letting us connect up with you and putting you through the ringer of trying to talk about everything from your background, your musical journey, your film work, and philosophy of arts, all in 1 hour. So it's been great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kirby. Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Steve, thank you for sitting across from me. I guess next hour we'll let you get on the other side of the glass. But we've talked about this before. We certainly do talk about this idea of apologetics, the need for you not only to know how to articulate a biblical point of view, but to defend a biblical point of view. But sometimes a lot of apologetics is left hemisphere, logical, linear, but there's another part of that is right hemisphere and cultural apologetics. And that's why we've talked about this issue of the arts. When we come back, though, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. There's a lot to talk about. We'll do that right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones, because we're going to be talking about the State of the Union address. Maybe some of you have some thoughts about what you would like President Trump to say tonight before the joint session of Congress. Let me, before we get any further, explain why over the last couple of days, because I've had some other people ask, why are you calling this an unofficial State of the Union address? Well, let's get back to basics. If you pull out your Constitution, I've got one right here by me. Article 2, Section 3 says in the Constitution that the President shall periodically give to Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. A typical State of the Union address usually takes place in January, sometimes in February, but certainly not in March, okay? This is something that usually happens in the early part of the calendar years. It is a time in which you can set the nation's budget, maybe talk about your plans for the economy, maybe talk about some progress or achievements that have taken place. And historically, until the last century, this was usually delivered in a written form. But in 1913, Woodrow Wilson, 28th U.S. President, began the practice of addressing Congress in person. That has happened ever since. Of course, first we had radio, now we have television. Now it's become kind of a theatrical production, and oftentimes goes much longer than I think either members of Congress nor even the framers would have intended, but that's the way it is. Now, why is this one different? Well, I'm reading from some material put together by National Public Radio. NPR said that the president will deliver his first address to a joint session of Congress since his reelection. It will sound somewhat like a State of the Union address, but it is not one that would be classified as such, because that usually has happened after a president has served a length of time. And of course, he has just simply come in here in January. The typical State of the Union address usually happens in January and has become quite a broadcast event. And so for the last 4 decades, presidents have opted not to designate their first speech to Congress as a State of the Union address, but more generally an address to Congress. Again, traditions can change, but that's really what we're talking about here. And there are going to be a couple of very important issues that you can imagine will surface. The D's are a good way to focus on that. First of all, deportation. No doubt he will be talking about the individuals who have been or will be deported under his executive order. That D will certainly last a while and certainly would be controversial. Another D, of course, has to do with Doge, and I suspect some people are even wondering whether there'll be some boos when he talks about some of this, because this, of course, has led to laying off different federal workers. Another one, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, is, of course, the economy, inflation on the one hand, and how that's related to tariffs on the other are certainly going to be important. And one other one, obviously, because of President Zelensky, we talked about that yesterday, being in the Oval Office, the dust up, the blow up, whatever you want to call it, what that might mean in terms of foreign policy. So there are many things that the president can address tonight. Love to know if you think that certain things should be addressed, certain topics should be addressed, what your expectations might be, and that is the case. My first article then is one by Dominic Pino, in which he gives his expectations for the economic effects of tariffs. And the tariffs are something which are coming into being today. So that's why I thought it would be good to talk about tariffs for just a minute. One, because I have no doubt he is going to mention those tonight. Number two, it is going to have an impact on the economy. Now, let's talk about pros and cons. Pros, I've talked about, and even the other day when we had Dr. Merrill Matthews here, he saw it almost always in the negative. I see some positives, not the least of which is the threat of tariffs against, for example, Colombia, caused them to open up the opportunity to deposit individuals who came here illegally from Colombia. The threat of tariffs to Canada and Mexico at least began to have some conversations about Canada on our northern border, Mexico on our southern border, to actually help us protect the border. You also have some automakers suggesting that if these tariffs are going to be there any length of time, maybe it would be a good idea to begin to manufacture more autos here in the United States rather than in another country. So you can say at least that it's had some positive effect, and I could go through a list of other positives, but let's talk about the potential negatives. Derek Pino puts it this way: probably a negligible effect on the inflation rate, at least as measured by CPI. That would be the Consumer Price Index. And if inflation doesn't budge much, then you might have some people that are supportive of Donald Trump's tariffs to say, see, it didn't really have that much negative effect. And Derek Pino suggesting maybe it won't. Number two, he talks about higher prices for goods to which the tariffs apply. Now, recognize that this might also cause more Americans to buy American rather than to buy things that are manufactured in, say, China. So we'll see where that goes. But if indeed foreign businesses have to compensate with the issue of tax increases that come from tariffs, they're probably not going to lower prices, although I suspect President Trump's going to argue that they will. I think just the opposite. They may try to pass those particular taxes or increase on to the American consumers. We'll see. Everybody has their opinion, and sooner or later, we're going to have facts rather than just opinions. A couple more real quickly. Maybe a negative impact on GDP growth, maybe even a negative impact on the number of jobs production and things of that nature by raising the prices of some things like steel, aluminum, oil, copper. These might leave less money available to pay workers, so that's a possibility. And then most importantly, if you've been paying attention to the stock market, right now, stock market is, that's how to put it nicely, underperforming because they are starting to try to schedule into their estimates on the value of stocks, trying to, if you will, calculate what they, as individuals in the stock market, estimate would be the impact of tariffs. So those are just a few things that we can talk about in terms of tariffs, which are now implemented today. Certainly by the end of the week, we'll have maybe some facts and figures and maybe a roundtable discussion on that. But let's take a break, and would love, before we move on to some other topics, and we have quite a few here today, I'd love to get your thoughts about, do you have any advice that you would have given to the president if he called you up and said, what would you like to have me talk about at the State of the Union address? So I thought I'd give a few of you a chance to maybe render your thoughts and opinions, and then we'll move on to some other issues, because it is now evidence, as my next article points out, that even though Donald Trump has, in some cases, signed executive orders, not everybody wants to follow them. No surprise, we'll talk about that and take some of your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, television host Mike Rowe has been an advocate for blue-collar workers who have kept this country running. He explains that opportunities have never been better for anyone willing to work and willing to learn a skill in demand. Unfortunately, we have 7 million men ages 25 to 54 who are not only not working but not looking for work. Economist Nicholas Eberstadt refers to that in a recent Washington Post op-ed as the flight from work. The U.S. currently has 11 million unfilled jobs. Businesses in every sector nationwide are desperate for workers, including positions that do not require high school diplomas. Mike Rowe has provided more than 1,000 scholarships to young people through his Mike Rowe Works Foundation. They are trained for skills that are in demand: welders, steam fitters, pipe fitters, mechanics. None require a 4-year degree. He says there's never been a greater need for skilled workers like right now. He says if you're inclined to think that way and work that way, the world is your oyster. Unfortunately, if you're not, and a man, you're probably sitting at home spending 2,000 hours sitting in front of a screen. A recent Fox News poll asked this open-ended question: what message would you send to government? A majority said, lend me a hand. The only other time a majority said that was during the pandemic, but we are 2 years past the pandemic and lockdowns. Mike Rowe argues that two things could be true at the same time. First, there are people who need a hand who are well-intended and willing to work. Second, many others have been given a hand and have done nothing with what they've been given. I'm always willing to give someone a hand up to better themselves, but I think it is time to question whether we should be giving a hand out to millions who won't work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we'll take some phone calls. Let me just again give the number. I don't know if I did before. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. I remember decades ago when Marlon Maddox was at a rally, and he said, let's all say unison the 800 number for Point of View. And everybody said it in unison. I thought, well, that's amazing. That many people have memorized the number. But in case you don't know it, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join us, we'll talk for just a minute about what you might expect or would hope to hear from the president about the State of the Union address. Then we're going to get into some other issues. But let's go out to Georgia first. Denise, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you so much. I just happened to turn on I'm in the car right now, so I don't have my notes in front of me, but I could do this in my sleep. We would just love, we just Federal Expressed a big document to U.S. Attorney Pam Bondi. We have been, you may remember Tucker Carlson stated in 2023, there is nothing more corrupt in this nation than higher education. And I assure you, we can prove it in Georgia. To give you an example, Sonny Perdue, who was our former governor, is now the chancellor. And we even I've been a whistleblower for over 10 years, and we even brought to his attention millions and millions of dollars under the table that are lining pockets in 2009. And I have a letter from him, and he says there's nothing I can do. And now he's the fox guarding the hen house.
Well, again, we've had oftentimes we've talked about the move from one group to another. If you look at an individual that was at FDA and now works at Pfizer, of course, we've seen this for years in what is oftentimes called the Iron Triangle. Individuals move from think tanks to the government to then a regulatory agency back to the agency they're supposed to be regulating. And, of course, there are just all sorts of examples that, back, and this goes back 30 years when I was in graduate school. We were talking about that. And, of course, we have a booklet on the so-called deep state and some of the corruption there. So I haven't heard as much about what happens in higher education, but every single day it seems like Elon Musk or some of the other individuals associated with him have surfaced other particular honeypots that have been used to fund particular organizations. And if you're really concerned about waste, abuse, and fraud, you should be supporting what is happening right now with the government. But it is amazing to me how many people seem to be out protesting and warning and actually even calling for. Well, it was a couple of cases I heard Elon Musk saying he's received all these death threats. Who would have ever guessed? So, Denise, if, again, we can find out more about what's happening in Georgia, be glad to report it. But I got a feeling what you are dealing with in Georgia, probably people are dealing with all over the country, don't you think?
Oh, there's no question about that. But I have to tell you, this is a purpose I never asked for, but I've accepted it. I used to work for the chancellor at UNC Chapel Hill, a vice president at Mercer. I know what I'm doing. And to tell you how bad it is, the attorney general in Georgia, his name is Chris Carr, he even sealed my documents, and he's running for governor. So does that tell you how bad it is down here? But I assure you, I fought the VA for another subject for 28 years, and I won, and I'm going to fight the Board of Regents just as long for my children and grandchildren in this nation.
Well, appreciate your phone call. Obviously, I don't have a chance to verify anything of that, but again, I think it is an illustration of why there are more and more individuals that have begun to open their eyes to the fact that there is a fair amount of waste, abuse, and fraud. The example I love to use is on two different occasions. We've had Dr. Merrill Matthews sitting across on our weekend edition, and he wrote a book years ago on how that was this whole area of waste, abuse, and fraud was surfacing in places like Medicare and Medicaid, primarily in Medicaid, but some in Medicare, and, of course, even questions about Social Security and the rest. That book has been around for a decade or two. As I've jokingly said, before there was an Elon Musk, there was a Dr. Merrill Matthews and many other individuals like that over the years. There were members of Congress that were talking about the misuse of funds and the way in which there was incompetence and in some cases a fairly significant amount of what could be considered to be fraud. And so again, we will see how individuals tonight in Congress respond to when the president talks about rooting out waste and abuse and fraud. I'm hoping that he has made the point of trying to make sure that every one of his numbers are easily fact-checked so that it doesn't end up being a, well, he said, they said kind of thing, because there is certainly enough fraud to go around. And so I'll take some more phone calls in just a minute, but one of the other articles I wanted to point you to is, as we've pointed out before, just because a president signs an executive order does not guarantee that everyone, either in the federal bureaucracy or even in the states, follow this. And as you well know, there has been an attempt by President Donald Trump, and he will talk about this tonight in his executive orders, to no longer have DEI kinds of separation on the basis of individuals on race and sex. Publicly funded institutions are not supposed to do that. There's a Supreme Court decision that's come down in that regard, and there are of course, executive orders the president has signed. Well, I bring you to this next article. This one is by James Lynch, and he actually documents an organization which I've just begun to find out about called Parents Defending Education, and they've found already over 100 essentially school districts in 20 different states 26 different states, and the Washington District of Columbia, which are actually violating what the president has ordered by creating what now they call affinity groups and providing safe spaces for so-called underrepresented individuals. Now, as you might imagine, many of these school districts that have these so-called affinity groups are in blue states: California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, just to mention a few. In Illinois, I know we have listeners there, have close to at least 24 school districts with these identity-based groups, twice as many as any other state. These are where you actually gather together individuals who are separated based on immutable characteristics or sexual orientation. That's Illinois. Let's go to Colorado. The Denver Public Schools have what are called belong groups, which again are an attempt to pull together associations for Black Latinx, that's their word, managers of color, women of color, people devoted to deconstructing privilege. Well, let's go on to Portland, Maine. We have listeners in Maine. The Maine public schools have affinity groups that are available to BIPOC and LGBT employees. Let's go to another one. State of Tennessee, that would be in Hamilton County. We have listeners there. School district paid a consultant $50,000 to conduct an Educators of Color affinity group, and then had other race-based training sessions there. And let's say we pick up one more, because there has already been some news that's been in the news about Missouri. And again, we have listeners there. A school district in Missouri continues to openly promote DEI in its newsletter, and even took the time to use the newsletter to attack President Trump. So what's going to be the follow-up to that? Well, I think you will hear that tonight, but one of those is that President Donald Trump, has tasked the current Attorney General, that would be Pam Bondi, with enforcing his DEI orders first in corporate America and then in federally funded educational institutions. And just the other day, the memo that came out from the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, instructed the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division to carry out Trump's directive to fulfill America's promise of equality under the law. Matter of fact, it goes into a couple of details, which I think I'll just leave out since we're coming to a break. But you can read this. It's about a 2-page kind of summary on what is taking place, and it is one of our articles on the website pointofview.net. Let me just real quickly mention what I did last hour, and that is we are one more time giving you an opportunity to contact your member of Congress, if you've not had a chance to do so, to tell your member of Congress no taxpayer funding for abortion. That's a take action item, which you might say, well, it's already been accomplished, because indeed there was an attempt by Donald Trump through the executive order to reinstitute what is called the Hyde Amendment. But this is an attempt to actually put this into law under H.R. 7. So this would be taking something which right now might exist under an executive order and making it permanent with a piece of legislation. We're convinced that right now the executive orders have taken care of some of these issues, but the next president could reverse those with an executive order. So today we're talking about the issue of abortion. You've already heard me talk about DEI. I think that's the next one coming up. Got a couple others in that regard. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to encourage you to contact your members of Congress to see if we can make some of these things in executive orders actually the law of the land. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Are you confused about changes happening in Washington, D.C.? Well, you're not alone. Are you frustrated that you can't get the full picture of what's happening from the mainstream media? You are not alone in that either. And that is why Americans need a voice they can trust, a voice that provides accurate news, trustworthy information, and most importantly, a voice that is anchored to God's Word. Point of View is that voice, but we need you. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week, where we encourage listeners like you to join the team of people keeping truth on the air. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a difference right now by visiting us online at pointofview.net and join the team. That's pointofview.net. Or you could call us toll-free to join at 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. One of the questions I have on the table is, first of all, what would you want the president to say tonight in this sort of unofficial State of the Union? So I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Might also put a second one on, which we'll get to in just a minute. Who do you think is going to be leading the opposition to what Donald Trump is doing? And I have a very good idea who that is based upon the second article we've posted. But just as a program note, let me just mention them tomorrow. After the State of the Union address, we will spend some time in the first section, really about the first half hour, talking with our good friend Gary Bauer, his reactions and your reactions to the State of the Union address, or the unofficial address, if you will, the State of the Union address to Congress. And then we'll have our good friend Sean McDowell will be with us. He's got this new book, Apologetics for an Ever-Changing Culture. And again, that's something we talk about so often here on Point of View. Well, tonight, of course, the president will speak, and then there's a traditional rebuttal. The rebuttal comes from Elisa Slotkin. She is a member of Congress. She actually comes from Michigan, in the 7th District in Michigan, a swing state, somewhat seen as a rising star. But I would have to say that if you wanted to try to pick somebody who is really beginning to surface as kind of the constant rebuttal to Donald Trump, it would be the senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy. And I think there are a couple things you can say about that. He may be thinking about running for the presidency, and oftentimes an individual that fills a gap, and there seems to be one right now. When you ask people, who's the leader of the Democratic Party, you get all sorts of interesting answers, but no one really begins to fill that role. But over the last couple of weeks, I think it is fair to say that Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut has been able to fill that role. And the article that is written here by Byron York, who is, of course, the writer with Washington Examiner, says that he is one of the Democrats urging his party to resist President Donald Trump on a wide range of issues. But let's for a minute go to the New York Times. The New York Times put it this way: Mr. Murphy has seemingly been everywhere all at once since Inauguration Day, staging a loud and constant resistance to Mr. Trump at a time when Democrats are struggling to figure out how to respond to him. And so then Byron York goes through some of the examples. He says, first of all, Senator Murphy has exhibited the usual resistance obsessions, focusing furiously on Trump, the Department of Government Efficiency head Elon Musk, and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. They go on to say that the Senator Murphy, was on CNN the other day and said that Trump and Musk are scheming with Putin to transition America into a kleptocratic oligarchy, to steal our data, to steal our Medicare, and to steal our Medicaid. At this point, Byron York goes, huh? I mean, there's quite a bit there, but I can give you the complete quote, and maybe it's worth giving you the complete quote because I don't want to ever be accused of, for example, making fun of somebody who is coming up with theory, kind of conspiracy theory out of the fever swamps of inside the Beltway. But again, this is what Senator Murphy said. The entire pretext for that meeting, meaning Friday, was an attempt to rewrite history in order to sign a deal with Putin that hands Putin Ukraine. This is disastrous for U.S. national security. This means that China will be on the march. Putin may not stop. America may be at war with a nuclear power. And for what? For what? It appears as if America is trying to align itself with dictators, that Donald Trump wants us to have our closest relationships with despots around the world because it makes it easier for him to transition America into a kleptocratic oligarchy where Elon Musk and Donald Trump rule and steal from the American people. If we were allied with democracies, it would be harder. But if the United States' closest partner is Russia, then it makes it a lot easier for Donald Trump, Elon, and their billionaire pals to steal from the American people, to steal our data, to steal our Medicare, to steal our Medicaid in order to enrich themselves. All I got to go is, phew. Really? But nevertheless, this is the argument. And after he finished at CNN, the host there is Dana Bash, said, well, there's a lot there. You think? And again, without any training, this is where I think it gets a little bit funny. Byron York has a little bit of fun at this. Says, look, I don't have any psychiatric training, so it would be unfair to suggest the senator is exhibiting some of the signs of fevered thinking. Aphrenia, I guess is what it's called, the phenomenon by which a person inclines to believe conspiracies may tie together unrelated information and events, weaving together in a narrative that is in line with what they perceive as truth, according to Psychology Today. But he says it does appear that he has discovered a pattern of relationships between things such as Medicaid and Ukraine that are, quite frankly, not related. But nevertheless, this is what I think is coming from an attempt to counter some of the things that President Trump is doing right now. So Byron York says, how many Democrats share Senator Murphy's views? And he says, well, it's not really clear, but it is clear that if Murphy plays a leading role in his party's response to Trump, Democrats will fall into the same Russia mania that characterized the resistance in Trump's first term in office. Remember, that was a Russia hoax and all the rest. That the White House is becoming an arm of the Kremlin. That was some of the phrases we heard from the first term in which Donald Trump was in office. As a matter of fact, Senator Murphy declared on CNN, every single day you hear from the National Security Advisor, from the President of the United States, from his entire security team, Kremlin talking points. How is the president to negotiate an end to Ukraine war with a domestic opposition like that? Byron York asks. And again, you can see that there are some people that are using that to ask questions of Donald Trump. In the meeting last Friday in the Oval Office, a reporter asked President Trump, for example, Europeans are worried that you align yourself too much with Putin. And Trump responded, well, if I didn't align myself with both of them, meaning, of course, the man sitting next to him, of course, President Zelensky and President Putin, we wouldn't have a deal. He says, you want me to say really terrible things about Putin and then say, hi, Vladimir, how you doing on the deal? Doesn't work that way. I'm not aligning with Putin. I'm not aligning with anybody. I'm aligned with the United States of America. And again, Byron York argues that what Senator Murphy seems to not understand is that the Trump plan could be the best path forward for Ukraine, which is in a terrible position after being invaded by Russia, now in its fourth year of war. It's totally dependent on outside aid. Just 2 days before the Zelensky meeting, Donald Trump told reporters, I've had very good conversations with President Putin. I've had very good conversation with President Zelensky. And until 4 weeks ago, nobody had conversations with anybody. It wasn't even a consideration. Nobody thought that you could make peace. I think you can. I think the wise assessment there is that there may be a limited opportunity. Yesterday, you heard me quote from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying, even if there's just even a 1% chance, isn't it worth trying to do that? But again, the reporter asked, but if Mr. Putin gets to keep the land that was claimed by force, if the Russians get to keep the territory that they claim by force, doesn't that send a dangerous message to China about Taiwan? And again, the response from Donald Trump, you try and take it away, right? We're going to do our best we can. We're going to do the best we can to make the best deal we can for both sides. But for Ukraine, we're going to try very hard to make a good deal so that they can get back as much as possible. We want to get back as much as possible, he has said there as well. And there are other individuals that have written about this, and one of those is a man by the name of Michael Lind, who wrote that Trump's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine fits in what he says the long tradition of presidents from Lincoln to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Eisenhower to Johnson and beyond, dealing with wars and dealing with aggression around the world. And perhaps there are good reasons to oppose Trump's Ukraine strategy, he wrote, but to be consistent, moralists to invoke American ideals ought to condemn then FDR and Churchill for agreeing to a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that lasted half a century after 1945, and they must condemn Eisenhower Eisenhower and Johnson for failing to take significant action to punish the Soviet Union for crushing democratic rebellions in East Germany, in Hungary, and in Czechoslovakia. And the point is being made here. We have done this before. When you're dealing with evil dictators, sometimes you can do the best you can do, and sometimes it isn't enough for certainly freedom-loving people, but this is at least the attempt being made right now by Donald Trump. On the other hand, you have the Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy using that to argue against Donald Trump, and I suspect tonight, if you turn on your TV after the speech, of course, you'll hear the rebuttal by Representative Slotkin, but I think you'll hear a lot from Senator Chris Murphy. He might be running for president. We'll find out soon enough. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
About a week ago, I had a commentary that had the title Counter March, and it was based upon a piece by Rich Lowry in which he was arguing that just as we had Herbert Marcuse talking about a march, a long march through institutions, now Donald Trump has a counter march to that. There's a different way to look at this, and that is our last article we've posted by our friend Victor Davis Hanson talking about a counter revolution. We're going to hear about a counter march or a counter revolution for some time, but I think it gives us a little bit of an idea of, again, how the president, that is President Donald Trump, is going to position some of the things he's doing tonight, because Victor Davis Hanson puts it this way. He says at some point, some president was going to have to stop the unsustainable spending and borrowing. To have a country left, some president would eventually have to restore a non-existent border and stop the influx of 3 million illegal aliens a year. Some commander-in-chief finally would have to stop the theater wars abroad. And in some respects, what he is saying is Americans right now are watching, and I think tonight we're going to hear in this presentation, this speech by President Trump, they're watching this long-awaited counter-revolution, he says, to bring the country out of the madness by restoring common sense of the recent past. He says it's easy to run up massive debts and hard to pay them back. Biological men, he says, should not manipulate their greater size and strength to undermine the hard work won accomplishments of women athletes. Affordable fossil fuels, when used wisely, are still essential to modern prosperity. American education must remain empirical and inductive, not regress into indoctrination and deduction. And he says it's easy to destroy a border and hard to reconstruct it. It was not Trump who invited in 12 million unaudited illegal aliens. Half of them could have been possibly criminals. Who is the real culprit in the Defense Department? The new secretary with the hard task of restoring the ideal among depleted ranks that our race, religion, and gender are incidental, not essential, to defeating the enemy and assuring our national security. Goes on to ask, is it really wise to divert money from needed combat units and weapons to indoctrinate recruits with social and cultural agendas that do not enhance but likely undermine our national defense? He goes on, but again, who are the real culprits, the true culprits, who so cavalierly turned a hollowed agenda into a weaponized tool to warp elections, harass political enemies, lie under oath, surveil parents at school board meetings, doctor court documents, and protect insider friends? And so, again, the point he's making is a lot of this happened when he was not in office for 4 years. And I think Donald Trump tonight, President Trump, will make a comparison to what was like just before he left office, especially before the pandemic hit, and what we actually find ourselves with right now. And I think also Victor Davis Hanson points out that the people that have followed Donald Trump, he says, are not high-fiving while firing people. They're not laying off miners or frackers and convincing them or directing them to learn how to code computers, or dismissing half of the country as deplorables. He says the left screams that those who are tasked with balancing a budget and pruning back a straggling bureaucracy are heartless, but really trying to provide a country for the future. And so he says, no, the pitiless are those who recklessly thought and sought to hire with borrowed money and fire people on the basis of their race, use federal programs to feather their own nest, and harassed and arrested those for their politics. We don't have SWAT teams raiding homes of ex-presidents right now. No one's trying to take a presidential rival in the future off of state ballots. No one is coordinating local, state, and federal prosecutors to indict, harass, and bankrupt an ex-president. And no president, his dementia sheathed by political insiders and a toadish media, is working 3 days a week, avoiding press conferences or stonewalling reporters' questions. He concludes with this really interesting line. No wonder the current normal seems abnormal to the status quo of the recent past. I've, of course, given you just a brief summary of it, but Victor Davis Hanson reminds us of what we've been through these last 4 years and why the president is doing some of the things he is doing. And it will be interesting to see the reaction to that tonight in the State of the Union address. Well, just before we end, I thought it would be good, since we started with a discussion about the arts, to maybe just mention real quickly the Oscars. Yes, I know you weren't watching it because no one else was as well. But in a classic, and this is an article that just came out recently, classic Oscars style, a movie that no one has ever heard of only grossed $41 million. By the way, some of the Christian films we talk about here have made more than this film. In the box office, took home Best Picture. If you are unaware, the movie is called Honora. It's a film, and again, I'm using this advisedly, so I'm going to clean it up a little bit. It's a film about a sex worker, that's also a prostitute, who marries a Russian oligarch. One of the writers put it bluntly and said, it's pretty much a porno film with a half-baked storyline about a stripper and her whirlwind romance with a rich mobster. And, of course, we know that oftentimes the movies that are now even nominated, much less finally selected for Best Picture, Best Director, whatever, are using still the DEI quotas and all of the rest. But there's a Christian review website, I'm never familiar with it, Geeks Under Grace, and they said, I think this is good summary. What's the goal of Honora? Unfortunately, I can't define the opening scene of the film as anything other than a pornographic movie. I can't with good conscience defend it, and I don't use the term pornographic lightly. I can go on, but you can kind of get the idea where we're going. And it just, again, illustrates how awful some of the stuff coming out of Hollywood is, and how out of touch Hollywood is. To pick a film that none of us listening to Point of View probably would go and see, and that apparently not very many other people have been able to go and see, is just a good illustration of that. This, I think, is going even beyond the pale. And sometimes the question around here is, should we even talk about it? But at least to let you know that we know it's there is, I think, significant. And there was one other point, and that comes from our friend Mac Walsh, because he didn't watch it, but apparently at least watched the clips, in which you had somebody stand up there and say, we gather tonight at the Oscars on the ancestral lands of the Tongva, the Tatavyama, and the Chumash peoples, the traditional caretakers of this water and land. And of course, you've got to have some kind of political statement about the indigenous people. Except Matt Walsh did the historical look and said, you know, she pays homage to the Tongva tribe, but the Tongva tribe actually moved into Southern California thousands of years after it had already been occupied by another ancient tribe. They killed and displaced those inhabitants and took over, and then they get to claim the title of indigenous, and if they get to claim it, so do we. As we've pointed out before, if you really start looking into the history that is used to make us feel guilty about the land that we're occupied, there was a lot of violence, a lot of course, the film shows depraved sexuality. This shows depraved violence. And that is just, again, your quick highlight of the Oscar films, why it's probably good you didn't take the time to watch them. That's all we have for today. We certainly want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. I had two producers today, so Karen and Steve, thank you for producing the program, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net.
and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.